destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, March 9th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Nick Seabrook, author of One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. And later in the show, Tim Shorrock will be joining us to discuss the reality behind the compensation being given to Korean laborers who were forced to work under Japanese colonial rule. Meanwhile, Biden will lay out his budget proposal in Philadelphia today. It includes a teeny tiny hike on earners over $400K to help fund Medicare and a corporate tax increase. The Senate has voted to reject the Democratic will of D.C. on new crime guidelines. Biden will not veto the Republican effort. The DOJ has found patterns of discrimination and misconduct in its 2-year investigation of the Louisville Police Department. A judge has delayed the release of 20 more hours of footage pertaining to Memphis cops' fatal beating of Tyree Nichols. Mitch McConnell took a tumble and now he's in the hospital. Oh no.
Oh dear.
The CEO of Norfolk Southern will appear in front of Congress today. Ed Markey's staffers are set to form the Senate's first union, voluntarily being recognized by the senator. Good on Markey. The Michigan House of Representatives, newly under Dem control, moved quickly to repeal right-to-work laws, passed LGBTQ protections, and expanded background checks for guns. State houses are important, fellas and ladies and everybody else. On the other side of sanity, Sarah Huckabee Sanders has signed a bill loosening child labor laws in Arkansas. The Republican staffer who accused CPAC head Matt Schlapp of sexual assault has come forward publicly. And lastly, 6 more Palestinians killed by Israeli forces in Jenin. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Fancy Communist writes in, Emma, why do you look so angry during the intro music? You look like you've just beaten the SH blank out of somebody. Do I?
You look super angry.
Yeah, I guess I should smile more. Fancy Communist.
Yeah.
Beat me too. You know what you should
Put
do?
a smile on your face.
I'm trying to get all my tabs open.
Why the
so
long-
that's
why the
the
long
furrowed
face?
brow situation.
Do you know the street harassment way of saying smile in the UK is cheer up, it might never happen.
Oh, yeah. That's a little even more explicit than the, hey, why don't you put a smile on that face, which I'm pretty sure every woman's gotten that before. I certainly have. But I am feeling better today. Had a bit of a migraine yesterday. Sam was generous enough to give me the yesterday off, so appreciate that. But we're back with an Majority Report Thursday, and we've got some great interviews and some fun clips. Let's start here, because I guess this happened in the middle of the show yesterday. You guys didn't get to it. Whew, it's a doozy. This interaction with Oklahoma Senator Mark Wayne Mullen. Mark Wayne, yes.
And I just want to be clear. His name is Mark Space Wayne Mullen, but as he decided to go forward with the portmanteau as Mark Wayne, as one word.
Oh, he did?
His name is officially Mark Space Wayne Mullen.
Right.
And, yeah,
Goes
that's
by
the sort
Mark
of like
Wayne.
fun individuality the guy type of kid who inherits a business can afford.
Right. This is him just expressing himself, right? And as Matt said, he did inherit a business, and yet you wouldn't know it based on well, maybe you would, but based on his kind of entitlement that he displays in this video. Here is Senator Mark Wayne Mullen in a hearing with Teamsters union head or official, one of the guys in leadership, Sean O'Brien.
The general president, Sean O'Brien.
And they go at it about unions, labor in general. And just a reminder, this guy, Mark Wayne Mullen, senator from Oklahoma, is a business owner who took over $1 million in PPP loans, had them forgiven, has made millions raising flags about ethics concerns while he's been in office as a senator, interacting with this union rep.
You guys don't mention that because, see, I started with nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, I started below nothing.
Okay, I would like to just pause it again. This guy inherited his business. By definition, that's not starting with nothing, right? All right, start over.
In that, because, see, I started with nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, I started below nothing. And I started growing this little plumbing company with 6 employees to now we have over 300 employees. And back in 2009, you guys tried to unionize me. My guys were making money. They're getting paid more than the union halls were paying their plumbers. Our benefits were better. But because we started bidding jobs that were union jobs and winning those, union pipe fitters decided they were going to come after us. They would show up at my house. They'd be leaning up against my trucks. I'm not afraid of a physical confrontation. In fact, sometimes I look forward to it. That's not my problem. But when you're doing that to my employees, and then when that didn't work, they started picketing our job site, saying, shame on Mullen. Shame on Mullen. For what? For what? Because we were paying higher wages? Because we had better benefits and we wasn't requiring them to pay your guys' exorbitant salaries?
All right, pause it just for 1 second, because he goes on at length, but this is less useful for the audience's perspective, or for people trying to analyze this, as when you see it as an interaction between a Republican senator and a union representative. That's part of it, but mostly this is indicative of an interaction between a business owner and a union. Because this guy's entitlement, when unions, the union, I guess, that his plumbing company, that was representing the workforce at his plumbing company, was asking for higher wages. Look at how quickly he turns it into, you're victimizing me. I won't pay you more, but you're victimizing me.
Yeah,
the way
he's talking is, this isn't Senator Mark Wayne Mullen. This is like boss Mark Wayne Mullen.
This is, and frankly,
I say that derisively, not like boss shit. No, I mean like he's like literally being a boss.
Yeah, and useful for people to know that this is a majority of bosses and how they view union labor in this country.
You talk about CEOs that are making all this money, and what do you make, Mr. O'Brien?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question.
Yeah, I know what you make, because in 2019, your salary was, what is this, $193,000? I'm sure you got some pay raises since then.
Yeah, when I was a
And the average UPS driver, the feeder driver, makes $35,000 a year.
and
what do you bring?
That's
to the
inaccurate.
Table? Hold on a second.
That's inaccurate. State
I've
facts.
got it right here.
State facts. That's inaccurate.
The average UPS feeder driver makes $35,000. If you don't know your facts, then maybe you should.
I know them because I negotiate the contract.
So I say one thing to you. What do you bring for that salary?
What do I bring?
Yeah. What job have you committed, or have you started? What job have you created? One job, other than sucking the paycheck out of somebody else that you want to say that you're trying to provide because you're forcing them to pay dues? And
No, we don't force them.
Senator, you've asked the question.
You're out of line.
Let him
man.
answer
Actually,
the
I
question.
haven't, and don't tell me I'm out
You
of line.
are out of line.
Don't tell me I'm out of line.
Well, you frame.
Don't tell me. I'm
frame,
making a statement.
You frame the statement
You need
like
to
a
shut
tough
your
guy.
mouth
Yeah.
because you don't know
You're
what
gonna
you're
tell me to
talking
shut my
about.
mouth?
Yes,
Yeah.
I did.
Hold it.
Yeah.
Hold it.
Yes, I
Tough
did.
guy. I'm not
Senator,
afraid of physical.
Senator,
You don't have
hold
to be,
it.
but don't sit there and tell me I'm out of line.
Senator, You made a statement, you asked the question.
I didn't ask a question.
You did it.
You did.
I answered the question.
You asked the question about how
Well, it
much
was
money,
rhetorical.
let him answer.
It was a rhetorical
Well,
question.
you may think it's rhetorical.
It was
Sounded to me
rhetorical.
like a question. Let him answer the question.
I'm not yielding my time to him. So if you're going to let me keep my time, that's fine.
You'll have your time. Let him, you ask
Your
a question, he has a
So-
right to answer that.
As far as my salary goes, my salary, if you follow me around, I actually look at this building. I bet you I work more hours than you do, twice as many hours.
That's impossible. But
No, that's true.
Sir, you don't even know what hard work is. You wanna follow my schedule,
Secondly, I'll do it in
please
a
follow
minute. Secondly, UPS feeder drivers, and you can quote Carol Tomei, who quoted this. They make $93,000 on the lower end. Some of them
said
making
feeder drivers.
$150,000.
I said feeder drivers.
Feeder drivers, tractor-trailer drivers. Some of them making $150,000 per year.
Some of them do.
And
I don't
most of them
disagree with that.
most of them
After
make
you've been
over-
there
most of
four-
them-
after you've been there 4 years.
Most of them make over 1,000.
Okay.
Most of them make over $100,000.
So reclaiming my time, I go back to the whole fact that, sir, you haven't created a job.
We haven't?
You haven't been there. You haven't.
Sure we have.
You haven't.
Sure we have.
Tell me one job that you created.
What are you talking? Be specific.
You're an
What do you mean?
employer?
No, we're
You
not an
employ
employer.
people?
No, but it's funny.
So, no, then hold on, then that's
we create
not creating
opportunity.
jobs.
We create opportunity because we
Sir,
hold
that's
we
not-
hold greedy CEOs
That's
like yourself
not-
accountable.
You're calling me a greedy CEO.
Oh yeah, you are.
There it is.
You want to attack my salary? I'll attack yours. What
go
did you
ahead.
make? What did you make when you owned your company?
When I made my company, I kept my salary down at about $50,000 a year because I invested every penny into it.
Okay, all right. You mean you hid money?
No, I didn't hide. Oh, hold on a second.
Okay, go ahead.
He said that's out of line. You said
right,
I
we're
was out of
we're
line.
even, we're
We're not even. We're not even close to being even.
Well,
You think it's smart? You think you're funny?
No,
You're
you
not.
You think you're funny?
No, I never said. Did I
You
smile?
frame
Did I laugh?
your opening.
Hold
statement.
on.
You frame your opening statement
No,
saying you're a tough
Senator,
guy.
continue.
This-
Senator, please
This is
continue your
behavior,
statements.
but sir, this is. I think it's great that you're doing this because
Me too.
this shows their behavior on how they try to come in and
No, I-
demonize a shop.
No, it's
and they
just-
say about intimidation, and it's not about intimidation.
This
it's
may
not the
show your
employees
behavior
anymore.
here. But stay on the issue, please.
The issue is, if you're really for the employee, then why are you against right to work? Why are you against private ballots? If you're really about the employee, let the employee make the choice. I'm not anti-union, but when you don't want to have a private ballot, that's not intimidating? That's not intimidating? Why wouldn't you want a private ballot? That is intimidating the employee. If you don't want a right to work state, don't force somebody to pay dues to an organization they may not agree with. Don't force somebody to do something
But are
they don't
benefiting
want to.
from the
That's called
collective
employee
bargaining.
choice. If you want to be part of a union, God bless you, be part of a union. I have no issue with that. But don't sit up here and say that an employee is the one that intimidates their employers are intimidating their employees, not becoming a union.
Okay, Senator,
That's not
thank
accurate.
you. Thank you very much. Senator Murray.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I actually would like to.
yeah, I mean, of course, he reclaimed his time. Didn't necessarily give him an immediate chance to respond there, but so much to say.
That family plumbing business, he sold it to. Let's see. What do you think? Do you think he gave that to the plumbers, all those plumbers he cared so much about? And
he made
hired?
it a collective.
You think he did that, or do you think he sold it to private equity?
Whoop! How much do you think he made?
No way.
I'm not sure. I'm kind of looking.
Well,
for that.
Tulsa World Report.
No way.
Tulsa World reports $31 million. That's how much wealth he accrued.
No, hold on.
In his career.
Wait, hold on. He had a $50,000 salary. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's a nice thing about investing in your business is you can later sell that, those investments to a private equity firm.
Yeah. So, okay. And there's so much there, right? One, he is being purposefully, he's purposefully admitting all of the other sources of wealth and just focusing on his own salary in an attempt to make
Do
himself.
you know Bill Gates only made $1 one year? Like,
Oh,
moron.
whoa! I mean, and the fact that he's so defensive when he knows he's lying about that is just shocking to me. But CrossFit Jim Dolan over there is a very wealthy man, a multimillionaire. And as I mentioned earlier, he had $1.4 million forgiven in PPP loans. And when he talks about the disparity in pay for a UPS driver versus the union representative, how is that the fault of the union, the man representing the union, who's making nearly $200,000, which seems completely fine and proportionate to his value.
Well, compared to like delivering on those six-figure jobs for certain drivers, like yes, we should be broadly like paying people more. That's not going to be Mark Wayne Mullen and private equity's agenda.
Right there. Well, they're going to cut labor costs. The reality is that Mullen is trying very emotionally and hysterically to invert the power dynamics here and claim that it's the people bargaining on behalf of these workers who are causing wages to be depressed. No. It's business owners like yourself. So when he's trying to divert the anger to the guy who works for the union, that's all to divert the spotlight from guys like Mullen there. And when he keeps focusing on job creators, that's such a myth, right? People like Mullen need plumbers and laborers for their business to be profitable. There's nothing benevolent about being a job creator in and of itself, right? I mean, at all, I would say. What is something that should be lauded are people like this union rep here. What is his name? Sean O'Brien, who are, despite that dynamic, fighting for workers to have a larger piece of the pie. Mullen is aggressively trying to do the opposite.
Yeah, should the workers be like prostrate and thanking their boss over and over and over?
That's what he would like.
Or thanking the people who are literally their job, what they are paid to do is advocate for workers. Yeah, they get a salary. Oh my God, a fate worse than death. A union guy, a union rep getting a six-figure salary, so he can feed his family and also protect and advocate for workers and fight for workers.
But that's what makes him so uncomfortable, Mullen. Is that relationship is laid bare when you have these kinds of hearings. That the worker doesn't need to kind of bow to the feet of their employer to thank them for getting their wage when you see that there's somebody that can fight for you to actually have better wages and protections. And it's not just going to be what the business owner, the job creator bestows upon you. So
Choi's argument is also disgraceful.
It's really ridiculous. Like a guy with a plumbing business acting like he's the job creator. Do you create that plumbing system? Who created the sewage system and that you're feeding into? Like this?
He didn't even create his business.
Right, exactly.
He got it from somebody else. He inherited it.
Yeah.
Hilarious. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will be joined by Nick Seabrook. We are back, and we are joined now by Nick Seabrook, professor of political science at the University of North Florida, author of One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. Nick, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Of course. So, gerrymandering. You describe it as a uniquely American problem. And I do think that our audience and other progressives have a sense of that, right? Just how ridiculous this is, our redistricting process. But just how terrifyingly unique is this particular problem?
Well, it's terrifyingly unique, and also in the present political environment, uniquely bad for Democrats and progressives, at least in the context of what's happened previously in U.S. history. Not only has every other advanced democracy that uses districts for its elections figured out that the way to minimize the effects of gerrymandering is to remove politicians from the equation. There's kind of a fundamental and unavoidable conflict of interest when the same people who are going to be running for re-election in these districts are also the ones who are responsible for drawing those lines and for configuring those districts in the first place. And so every other nation has realized that you need some kind of independent entity free from political control and influence if you're going to get fair district boundaries. But it's also been the case that over the last couple of decades, the Republican Party has been particularly successful at using gerrymandering as a tool to boost its fortunes both in state elections and at the federal level as well. So we've kind of had a perfect storm of gerrymandering where we're the country that is most uniquely vulnerable to this pernicious influence on our democracy. And it's a tool that has kind of been overwhelmingly wielded by one side of the political spectrum in recent years.
And I want to get to current day in a little bit, but what I really appreciated about your book is that you go at length through the history of this concept of gerrymandering. And I love that you emphasize that gerrymandering, while toxic, was not really against or necessarily against the founding fathers' intent, because I love any opportunity to put a crack in the founders' mythology, right? Because I think it's a bit harmful to consistently return to, well, what did the founders intend, and pretend like they were divine gods in and of themselves. But some of what's so fascinating is that even if before it was called gerrymandering, this practice was a part of the way that some of the founding fathers envisioned the American political system.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the stories I focus on quite a bit in the book is how in the very first federal election that took place after the ratification of the Constitution, so the 1788 elections for Congress, less than a year after the creation of the Republic, the founding fathers were already trying to gerrymander each other out of political control. And this was all going on in the state of Virginia. And it was the culmination of a long-running, decades-long feud between several of the kind of titans of the founding era, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison on one side, and Patrick Henry on the other, three of the most influential political figures in Virginia. And while Jefferson and Madison were very influential at the federal level, both at the Constitutional Convention, and of course, both subsequently became president of the United States, Henry had kind of consolidated his power within Virginia itself and had opposed the ratification of the Constitution in 1787. And so he was very much set on preventing James Madison from getting elected to Congress in that first federal election. And so he used his influence in Virginia to draw Madison into a district where he was surrounded by kind of political foes of voters that might be hostile to him. And he recruited James Monroe to run against Madison in that election. But Patrick Henry did not have the same kind of tools and data and information available to gerrymander in 1788 that the politicians of today have access to. And his attempt was singularly unsuccessful. Madison not only won the election, but he did so in a landslide. And he went on to introduce the Bill of Rights before the first Congress after winning that election. So it's interesting to ponder how different US history might have been if Patrick Henry had been successful in one of these very early examples of American gerrymandering.
What does that look like? Is it just corralling all of the wealthy landowners into one specific district for an election? I mean, how does that manifest itself, especially when there's such a small sliver of people that have the capacity to vote at that time period?
So the actual logistics of this attempt at gerrymandering were, I think, with hindsight, somewhat ham-fisted. Obviously, this was the first election, so it's not like he could look to prior results to get any kind of sense of which areas were likely to support Madison and which were likely to oppose him. So what he did was he looked at how individual counties in Virginia had voted in the elections to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And so he felt that if a particular county had been opposed to the ratification, maybe that would be a county that would be hostile to Madison. And so he kind of pieced together a set of counties that included both Madison's home county and Monroe's home county. He cobbled them together into a district that he was kind of his best guess at one that might be hostile to Madison. And actually, subsequent analysis has suggested that there were much more effective ways that he could have gerrymandered the seat to make it difficult for Madison to win. He just didn't have the information to know that at the time.
Oh, well, now we do. And we'll get to that as well. But the term gerrymandering, as it begins to become a bit more of a practice, I did not realize it was actually, or maybe I did, and I forgot it. I think I did in college. I learned that it came from a literal guy with the last name Jerry, but it came out of Massachusetts. Talk about how that began to be a bit of a practice, starting really in the 19th century.
So gerrymandering had been going on for almost a century at this point, before we even had a word to describe the phenomenon. And much of the origin story about the term gerrymandering, I kind of found to be in many ways incorrect. And the individual who kind of often gets blamed for inventing this phenomenon, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, really was not in many ways directly involved in the creation of the district in 1812 that kind of spawned his infamy and which gave us this term. It was also the case that it was originally pronounced Gerrymander, as you might suggest from this portmanteau of the last name of Governor Gerry and the salamander that this district was said to resemble. But it was actually the state legislature in Massachusetts in 1812 that was responsible for creating this district. And Gerry had kind of signed the plan into law somewhat reluctantly, didn't really want to kind of create tension within his own political party. So he went along with this. And ultimately, this is really the one thing that he is remembered for historically, which is unfortunate because he had a long and extremely commendable political career. He was active during the Revolution. He ran weapons through his hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts, to support the Revolutionary War effort. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He later served as vice president under James Madison. And if he'd been a younger man, most likely would have been elected president in his own right. But he actually died before the conclusion of his vice presidential term. And yet today, this is kind of the one thing that we remember him for, that he lent his name to this unseemly practice of manipulating elections, with the further indignity of having his name mispronounced in the modern term gerrymander.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, that is unfortunate, but it is also interesting too. You mentioned the revolution, so it reminded me how this practice also was kind of stolen from the House of Commons as well. Talk about the roots of this redistricting, finagling coming from the England itself.
So kind of delving even further back into the history of gerrymandering, I went back first into the colonial era, where I found that a number of British colonial officials were engaging in gerrymandering when it came to the districts that were drawn to elect the colonial legislature. And most often this was used to boost their own power and authority, and to reduce the influence that the colonists, their constituents themselves, had on the politics of the colonial period. So it was kind of a tool for the British Crown to use to exert control over the Americas. But going even further back into the mists of British history, really from the very creation of the House of Commons in the wake of the Magna Carta and the very first constituencies that were used for electing members of the British Parliament, there has been shenanigans that have been going on in terms of the drawing of those districts. And in particular, there was a long tradition in British political history of something called a rotten borough, which in essence was a system whereby the noblemen of the time, even with this veneer of democracy in the form of the House of Commons, were able to corruptly maintain their influence over the workings of Parliament. And they did so by drawing districts so that only sometimes as few as a handful of individual voters were responsible for electing members of Parliament. And they were thus able to corruptly influence both the voters and the MPs themselves through bribery or patronage. And even as late as the 19th century, there were members of the House of Commons that were elected by as few as 50 to 100 individuals. So this was kind of the early forerunner of the American gerrymandering that we see today.
So how did that kind of get curbed in Britain and not in the United States? Was it because of political revolution? I know maybe this is a bit of a turn away from U.S. history, but I'm just curious.
So there were a couple of significant pieces of legislation that were passed in Great Britain during the mid to late 19th century. One of those was the Representation of the People Act, which ended this practice of having members of parliament elected from these kind of small, sparsely populated districts. And then later on, the UK created what are called boundaries commissions. In essence, they turned the control over the drawing of districts for the House of Commons to an independent commission that was kind of insulated from the influence of politicians themselves. And this is the approach that spread first throughout the British Commonwealth and then later into basically every other nation that uses districts for its elections, that you have some kind of independent commission or some kind of independent government agency that is responsible for drawing districts in order to ensure that the elected politicians are not able to meddle in that process.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, there can be some lessons potentially gleaned from that when we talk about reform. But just one more thing about some of the earlier history, because I liked the way that you framed what Lincoln did in terms of this isn't technically gerrymandering, but it is an example that these kinds of machinations have happened throughout history in terms of how Lincoln essentially was granting statehood during that time, and that was a way to solidify power as well. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I define gerrymandering fairly broadly in the book as any circumstance in which political boundaries are manipulated for some kind of partisan or political purpose. Mostly because I wanted to be able to talk about the stuff that Lincoln and some of the other Republicans were doing in the mid to late 19th century. And one of the major issues in Washington, both before, during, and after the Civil War, was the question of when U.S. territories would become states in their own right and on what terms those statehoods would proceed. And prior to the Civil War, there was kind of this rule of thumb that was used for creating new states, under which a state or a territory, as it was at the time, would only be considered for admission once its population had grown large enough that it would be entitled to one seat in the House of Representatives. But once the Civil War broke out, and once the question of how new states would be admitted and on what terms, and the political benefits that this could potentially bring Lincoln in his re-election bid came to the forefront, that rule of thumb was pretty much jettisoned, as was any semblance of adhering some of these new statehood admissions to the Constitution.
I'd say good. Right? I mean, that's an example of kind of these rules being, I guess, used for the better side, which I feel like it seldom happens.
Yeah, and a lot of the historians who have analyzed this kind of recognize, as many did at the time, that that this probably went against the Constitution, certainly with the admission of West Virginia during the Civil War, which had itself seceded from Virginia, which had seceded from the United States, but also with the admission of Nevada as well, which had only a few thousand residents at the time that Lincoln and the radical Republicans kind of brought it into the Union. It was probably justified at that point. But once we move into the late 19th century, what we see is that Lincoln's successors in the Republican Party kind of used this same playbook to add a whole bunch of other new states. And probably the most egregious of these was splitting the Dakota Territory into two independent units, North Dakota and South Dakota, and then immediately admitting both of them as new states. And so the incentive was that if you do it that way, instead of getting 2 new Republican senators, you get 4 Republican senators. And instead of getting 3 electoral college votes, you get 6 electoral college votes for the Republican Party. And so the statehood shenanigans considered well into the 1880s, even as the expediency of the Civil War and Reconstruction as a justification were no longer really on the table.
Well, and then we live with that today, where in the prior Congress we had 50 Democratic senators and 50 Republican senators, and the Democrats represent 40 million more people, really, because of the way that that was so aggressively pursued, even which is unfortunately undemocratic. But let's then move into the 20th century, because this is really when this process begins to ramp up, and there were some efforts by the courts to curb it, but they were largely unsuccessful, is my understanding. How did the courts try to approach gerrymandering as a practice, and what's your sense of how they were able to restrain it, if at all?
So the courts largely stayed out of debates about the drawing of legislative districts until the 1960s. And what ultimately prompted their involvement was the phenomenon known as malapportionment. And malapportionment essentially is a similar kind of idea to the rotten boroughs in the UK that I talked about earlier. You have a situation where districts in the same state, in the same legislature, have dramatically different populations from one another. And what happened over the first half of the 20th century is that America's urban centers grew significantly in terms of their population, but their representation in state legislatures and in Congress was not increased commensurate with the growth in their numbers. And so by the 1960s, America's cities were significantly underrepresented in both state and federal governments, and rural areas were overrepresented. And of course, the rural representatives who were benefiting from this resisted any attempt to try and reform things democratically, because they were still reaping the benefits of this imbalance in terms of numbers. And so it wasn't until the 1960s where a series of Supreme Court decisions created this principle called one person, one vote, after which the book itself is named, which to this day mandates that all of the districts within a legislative chamber have to have equal populations to one another. And while this was obviously a very positive development for democracy, it also kind of served to put gerrymandering on steroids to an extent, because now every single state would have to redraw every single one of its districts every 10 years after a new census in order to maintain compliance with this one person, one vote principle. And so redistricting and gerrymandering became not just something that happened whenever politicians had a particular inclination to do it, but something that came about much more frequently now that redistricting is happening all the time, every 10 years. And this is sort of what I refer to as the modern era of gerrymandering, where something that had been ubiquitous but infrequent became an everyday occurrence across the nation.
And also incredibly racialized, too, in terms of what it being on steroids by that point. How, in terms of looking at the maps, post this decision, post this weigh-in by the court, how much more did that accelerate the racial divisions in some of these gerrymandered districts?
It certainly was a major component of the ways in which particularly southern state legislatures, which had previously been able to suppress the influence of minority populations through overt disenfranchisement. But with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the more aggressive enforcement by the federal government of the 15th Amendment, suddenly those traditional tools of disenfranchisement were no longer available. And the registration rates of Black voters across the South began to surge. And so what these state legislatures realized is that gerrymandering was a potent new tool that they could now use to ensure that these newly enfranchised Black populations would still not be able to have a significant influence on government. And so they used some of the very same gerrymandering techniques that today get used by Republicans to disadvantage Democrats to ensure that that Black voters did not have a voice in state government. And it took another couple of decades of litigation. It took amendments by Congress to the Voting Rights Act in the 1980s for the problem of racial vote dilution that emerged after the civil rights movement to really be effectively addressed.
Well, good thing, none of that has been touched by the courts or anything like that, right?
Yeah, luckily that problem was solved and we never have to worry about it again. There certainly hasn't been any backsliding there.
In all seriousness, though, I mean, the recent rollbacks by the kind of extremist right-wing Supreme Court, now we're in more modern times. I mean, how has that affected gerrymandering efforts? I know at the same time some Democrats are being more aggressive on that front, gerrymandering themselves in certain states once they've gotten control of state legislatures. But that obviously is only a temporary hole plug.
Yeah, so almost as soon as the decisions of the 1980s and the legislation I talked about had really provided strong legal remedies for racial vote dilution, the emerging conservative majority on the Supreme Court began to undermine those, beginning with a series of cases in the 1990s where they limited the ability of states to draw majority-minority districts, so districts that were drawn primarily to allow previously disadvantaged and marginalized populations to have an effective voice in government. And then more recently, and there is a case pending at the Supreme Court right now called Merrill versus Milligan, we've seen the court start to further undermine the progress that was made by the Voting Rights Act. And so this was a case that came out of Alabama. Alabama, which has a Black population of around about 28%, drew just one of its 7 U.S. House districts in a way that would allow Black voters to elect representatives of their choice. And the lower court said that was a violation of the VRA. You have to go back and draw a second Black influence district in order to be in compliance. And the Supreme Court stayed that ruling. They allowed the plan to go into effect. And when this case ultimately gets decided, probably in June or July of this year, it's going to further weaken those Voting Rights Act protections that minority voters have relied on in order to increase their representation in both Congress and state legislatures over the last few decades.
Expand a bit more on that, why that's so harmful in particular to just have one Black district, because it is less percentage-wise than the percentage of the Black population in the state, but it's more than that, right? It's more than just that difference in percentage. It's the fact that these voters are being cobbled into one district so that no one else is threatened, and that you kind of have somebody on an island representing black voters as opposed to having their influence be more spread out.
Right, and so what the GOP did in Alabama was to pack a large number of black voters into this one congressional district, but then they also divided the rest of the African American populations in the state among as many districts as possible. And so this ensures, firstly, that this one seat is always going to elect an African American to Congress, but it essentially ensures that black voters elsewhere are not able to have any effective influence on the results. And this is kind of the logic of racial vote dilution, that if you submerge marginalized voters in a significant enough population of white voters, and when you have racially polarized voting present, when white Americans tend to vote for different candidates from black Americans or Americans of other groups, it has the effect of shutting out that population from political influence entirely. And this was the technique that was used after the civil rights movement to undermine the influence of newly enfranchised black voters. And if we see this case get decided in favor of Alabama, that's going to enable and embolden states to kind of backslide and start using those tactics much more significantly than they have been allowed to in recent years.
Lastly, that is the state of the fights on the Supreme Court level. But in terms of other reforms, what's your sense of where we are at right now at the start of 2023?
So I tried to make this a book that was not entirely pessimistic, although obviously there are a lot of reasons for concern about the health of American democracy and the threats to that come not just from gerrymandering, but from election subversion, from voter suppression, and from a whole host of other anti-democratic sentiments as well. But the note of optimism that I tried to conclude the book with is that we have made some significant progress at the state level, particularly over the last decade or so. And overwhelmingly, when the American people are given the opportunity to weigh in on this question, either through surveys or through the opportunity to vote for an initiative, a constitutional amendment in their state, Democrats, Republicans, Independents all say and all vote to get rid of gerrymandering. We have seen initiatives that reform the redistricting process to reduce gerrymandering passed in states as diverse as Florida, Michigan, California, and Utah. We have seen a number of states successfully use both lawsuits in state Supreme Courts and the citizens' initiative process to address partisan gerrymandering in their respective jurisdictions. And there are a lot of people working to try and fix this problem. The good thing is that we know what we have to do. We know what the solution is. The solution is simply to take this power away from politicians and insulate it from political influence. That for many, many decades now, we've had a system where the voters don't get to pick their politicians, the politicians get to pick their voters. And I'm optimistic because every time the American people get to vote on this, they seem to vote the right way. The question is just giving them that opportunity, putting in the groundwork to get measures on the ballot that allow for redistricting reform to happen.
Nick Seabrook, the book is called One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. Nick, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will be joined by Tim Shorrock. We are back, and we are joined now by Tim Shorrock, investigative journalist. And Tim's going to be discussing this agreement between South Korea and Japan. And on its surface, it seeming like a good thing, but there being some really troubling things underneath the surface. Tim, thanks so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. So, this is being billed as reparations for the Korean people, and I want to get to the way it's being advertised and the headlines about it in a second. But I'd love to start at the beginning to give our audience a sense of just the initial horrors here. Japan's colonization of Korea in the early 20th century, which is the kind of genesis of these supposed reparations. And what happened there, and why is repair needed in this instance?
That's a big question, but first of all, the word reparations, there is no reparations here. Japan and its corporations who exploited these slave laborers will not pay a cent into the compensation fund. Instead, South Korea is paying the funds. And I would say that there's a historical analogy to this pact would be the victims of Nazi slave labor camps receive compensation from, say, the governments of Poland and where they came from instead of the German state or companies like IG Farben. I mean, it's really a sham agreement and very shameful for it to be advertised as a huge breakthrough by the Biden administration. And in terms of the colonial period and World War II, it really shows an incredible lack of understanding and respect for what Koreans went through during that 35-year period of colonialism. I mean, Japan, colonized Manchuria north of Korea. It colonized the entire Korean peninsula. The southern part of Korea was used as a place to grow rice and ship it all to Japan. Japan built industries to exploit, Korean resources and Korean workers. It was completely controlled by Japan. Japanese forced Koreans to learn the Japanese language. They were not allowed to speak Korean. They were forced to worship at these nationalistic Shinto shrines, adopt the Japanese imperial religion. And the repression against Koreans in Japan was horrendous. Starting when the first uprising that took place in 1919, March 1st, 1919, when thousands of Koreans joined to oppose Japan's colonization, and the army and its police went out and just slaughtered thousands and thousands of people. But also Japan was very clever in terms of running a kind of counterinsurgency operation in colonial Korea, because it trained its own Koreans. It built it brought Koreans into its army, into its police forces, and so there was this huge opposition to Japanese colonialism, and then there was all these people who collaborated with Japanese colonialism, as military officers, police, and so on. And so, that split within the Korean population is really at the heart of the Korean division at the end of World War II, and also the Korean War, which was really a civil war, because the people that opposed Japanese colonialism and fought Japanese colonialism became the powers in North Korea after the division and when it was under Soviet occupation. South Korea under U.S. occupation, all the people that had collaborated with Japan became part of the U.S. government that it created, and that led to the Korean War. And also, it's really important to note that, the longtime dictator of South Korea, Park Chung-hee, who was himself trained in the Japanese military during the colonial period in World War II. He served in the Japanese military, and he signed under very strong U.S. pressure in 1965. He signed a normalization treaty with Japan that the Japanese are now citing as the reason they don't have to pay compensation. They say all that was settled in this 1965 treaty. So, ever since then, Koreans have been demanding, compensation and apology for what happened. And Japan has, when was it? In 1995, one of the rare socialist prime ministers of Japan actually made quite a full apology. But the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, led by Prime Minister Kishida, has always sort of downplayed that apology. And in fact, in this last agreement, they just said they'll refer to past apologies. They didn't make any new apology or anything. So I'll stop there. That's the background.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'd love to dive even further into that background, because for people that don't realize, it was hundreds of thousands of Koreans forced into slave labor during the early part of the 20th century, before the end of World War II, when that colonial infrastructure and those collaborators ended up just immediately kind of shifting to the United States' efforts there, which was a big part of the genesis of the Korean War. And there were also comfort women during this period, Korean women who were enslaved as sex slaves, and they're still, despite all of that harm, there's recognition to a degree, but it's begrudging, and also, as we'll get into with this agreement, wildly insufficient, especially when you take the United States' role into context, and the fact that the U.S. really used the colonial infrastructure of Japan in order to wage its anti-communist war in Korea.
Absolutely. A lot of Americans don't know that South Korea in the first years of the U.S. occupation was under actually a U.S. Army military government, which ran Southern Korea. And they put together this government of landlords, collaborators, open fascists that had collaborated with the Japanese. And at that time, from about 1946 to 1949 or so, there was a massive armed resistance against the U.S. military government and the Syngman Rhee government that was installed by the U.S. And it was actually, one of the first mass, use of anti-communist violence, mass anti-communist violence that took place in Southern Korea long before the Korean War. I mean, the mass slaughter there is unbelievable, and it's becoming clear. Many Korean historians have been writing books about it and delving into this period in the last 20 to 30 years, but it's something that Americans know virtually nothing about. To the way the America presents the Korean War is it began suddenly without notice when North Korea and, aided by Stalin and Mao, and cruelly invaded South Korea. North Korea did invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950. But, they saw it as a way to kick the U.S. out of the Korean Peninsula. And, that's the genesis for the Korean War, was this massive war against the left early on, and the anti-colonial left, the people that resisted having this this kind of right-wing government imposed on them, and that history is very important, and this is really a reflection on it.
And it's important also to understanding the context of what North Korea is now, right? I mean, the American understanding of North Korea as a totalitarian state, as a state that represses its people, is starving. I mean, that is all said with zero context, and everything you just said there is that context.
Zero context. And what's really ironic is that, the U.S. divided Korea, made the decision to divide Korea at the 38th parallel, one day after it dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. And Japan by then had decided it was about to surrender, right? Americans may remember that the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in the last days of World War II. And at that time, the Soviet Union, under an agreement with Franklin Roosevelt that had been made, long before, invaded Manchuria to push the Japanese out and was pushing into Korea. And U.S. officials were very concerned that the Soviets would bring with them these Koreans who had gone to Manchuria to fight the Japanese into Korea.
And they'd have more of a claim.
One of them was Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea. And so really for 75 years, the United States has been at war with the Manchurian Korean communists. It's a straight line from then until today, which does not excuse at all or justify the kind of raged government and totalitarian state that they have in North Korea. That's over decades has been created, but that's the genesis of it.
Yeah, and I mean the also anti-communist fears are 100% the genesis too, because the United States was terrified that the Soviets were going to be able to be greeted as liberators, or there would be sympathies there, and that's an important part of why they so quickly filled that vacuum in Korea and attempted to make its influence felt immediately, basically, if that's correct.
That's correct. And, the way that the Biden administration and all its think tank flunkies in the newspapers like the Washington Post have promoted this agreement, it's a complete whitewash of what really happened. And it's a complete whitewash of the fact that Japan and its corporations do not pay into this compensation fund is just to me, it's just incredible that's hailed as some kind of fantastic diplomatic breakthrough by Blinken and these people. And the other thing is that this is nothing new. I mean, it's being promoted by the Biden administration and Blinken as and people like columnists like Josh Rogan in the Washington Post. It's like, finally South Korea and Japan are coming around to understanding the great threat from China and North Korea, and they're joining with us in our strong opposition to them. Well, the fact is that, a similar agreement was actually made under the Obama administration. Blinken actually brokered this agreement about sex slaves and forced labor in 2015, an agreement that included no input whatsoever from the women who were exploited as sex slaves, and was rejected by South Korea and then the next government of Moon Jae-in. It was completely rejected. The agreement completely fell apart. That too was hailed by Blinken and Obama as a great breakthrough. And another fact is that the U.S. has been trying to link up Japan and South Korea into a strategic alliance really since the 1965 treaty. And I'm actually writing a book about this, because this is the hidden, untold story of South Korea and Japan, is the way that the United States almost immediately after World War II tried to bring back Japan into Southern Korea and link them up again. And this is kind of the final stamp on that alliance, because Biden actually, calls it now a trilateral alliance. and it's probably deeper than it's ever been. But I really am skeptical that this is going to be, go through in Japan, in South Korea, where it's been strongly opposed by, the victims, survivor groups, as well as many progressives. The leading progressive, newspaper, Hankyoreh, has completely denounced this agreement. And, many Koreans are really, really angry about it. And Yoon, the president of South Korea, who's now going to get a state visit with Biden for his, in April, for his great diplomacy, and he's going to be rewarded, for this agreement with a state visit to the White House. He is, he won. He's very, very right wing and militaristic. He won by the narrowest of margins. So he doesn't really have, he's not very popular in South Korea. Japan, it's a mixed reaction. I think among people in general, South Koreans and Japanese, there's a lot of friendship between normal citizens of the both countries, and people like to visit each country. And, there is friendship, but there's this real deep tension about these kinds of issues. And in Japan, the dominant right-wing politics of the Liberal Democratic Party is denial of its crimes. I mean, they deny sex slaves. These people were paid prostitutes. They all knew what they were doing and they were getting into, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a flat denial of the cruelty, and that's part of this, sham agreement, I think. So I'm very curious to see, how this proceeds, because it has to be approved in Japan as well as in South Korea.
So if I'm reading this right, this is like a United States brokered attempt to create to paper over this history, to attempt to accelerate some sort of healing so the United States can have an even larger stronghold in the seas and in the proximity of China, right? It is very much in the United States' interests to have a healed relationship between South Korea and Japan, plus the reopening right now of 4 military bases in the Philippines, plus the 2 new weapons and submarine agreements with Australia. Like, is this to be viewed within the larger, broader context of the Biden administration's insistent belligerence with China?
Well, absolutely, and also belligerence with North Korea. I mean, there was a possibility of an agreement that crashed in 2019 when President Trump went and met with Kim Jong-un, but his attempt to make the peace with North Korea completely collapsed when North Korea made a offer to shut down 80% of its nuclear facilities in exchange for a lifting of sanctions. And Trump wouldn't lift sanctions, and so the agreement collapsed. And tensions have risen since then, very high. And North Korea has continued to develop its missile capability to hit U.S. facilities, U.S. bases. And when we talk about U.S. military expansion, don't forget, Okinawa is. The islands of Okinawa have been occupied by the United States military since 1945, despite a kind of sham, agreement in 1972 to return Okinawa to Japan. It's still occupied by the U.S. military, and the bases there are being there's massive U.S. bases there, Marine bases in particular, that Okinawans have wanted removed for decades. And these are now being, built up and solidified and strengthened. And many people in Okinawa and Japan fear that they will become, that's going to make them even more of a target in any kind of war between future war between the U.S. and China over, say, Taiwan. This is all that they're interested in. I mean, Biden and Blinken don't give a rat's ass about the victims of Japanese colonialism. I mean, if they did, they would have pressured the Kishida government, to to a kind of make an actual apology and to compensate them. And instead, they didn't push at all, and like they also tried to make it look like there was no U.S. footprints on this. Unfortunately, it was just between South Korea and Japan, and they had nothing to do with it. Unfortunately, Rahm Emanuel, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, blew the cover off that by going very public and saying, we've been meeting with them hundreds and hundreds of times to make sure this agreement.
Subtlety is not Rahm Emanuel's strong suit.
No, not at all.
Well, I really can't thank you enough. This is fascinating stuff and really important. So I greatly appreciate your time today. Tim Shorrock, where can people find your work and more about your writing, particularly about Asia?
The best place is timshorrock.com, TIMSHORROCK.com. And I have a whole archive there of stories and documents that I've collected, over the last 45, 50 years.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. All right, guys. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up the first hour of the show, head into the fun half where we will be taking your calls, reading your IMs, doing some fun little ditties and clips and such. Matt, what's happening?
We're doing ditties?
Ditties, yeah. That's like just random ditty.
Isn't that a song?
Oh, yeah, we're singing.
I didn't know there's a musical element to the fun half today. I better warm my voice up.
Yeah, I don't know. I expelled all of my actual wordsmithery in those two conversations. So we will be doing some fun stuff because, some of it is just responding to hilarious goings on at Twitter that Elon Musk is doing. So not a clip, but still a fun story.
Yeah, I mean, picking the worst possible foil you could ever pick with. Have you seen this? The guy the disabled fellow that he's saying you don't do any work, and it's actually my lawyers told me I need to not.
No,
say
that's what I want
that.
to talk about. Literally,
yeah. Dave, what should I say?
Yeah, Dave, what should I say? But yeah. Also, we have a Brandon.
Oh, hello, Brandon.
Hello, hello, hello.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, Matt, what's happening though on Left Reckoning?
Oh yeah, on Left Reckoning, there'll be a Patreon episode. We were talking to Ange, one of our listeners, going back to TMBS days, about Australia. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
Brandon, what's happening over on the Discourse?
We have a new episode out for you, or we will by end of the week, where we discuss which member of the Justice League is most likely to say the N-word to prevent a catastrophe. The results might shock you.
Oh, what a tease. All right, check that out. Brandon, not Brandon, that's you just spoke. Matt.
We're all Brandon
hello,
now.
Matt Binder.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. What's happening over on Doomed and Scam Economy?
Well, we got a new Scam Economy episode. Finally, a new Scam Economy episode at scameconomy.com and at youtube.com/Matt Binder. I spoke with Bennett Tomlin of Crypto Critics Corner, basically to break down two of the major things that have been happening in the crypto world over the past couple of weeks, and that is the the various banks that have ended their relationship with various crypto exchanges, one of which specifically worked with crypto companies and just went under. And we also spoke about the other thing that has gone terribly wrong for crypto, and that is the regulatory crackdown on crypto staking. If it sounds too much, don't worry. We break it all down. We don't get into the weeds. It's very understandable. And you too can see why crypto is screwed at scameconomy.com and youtube.com/Matt Binder.
Awesome. And then on ESVN over on Monday, we're definitely on next Monday going to be talking about this Lamar Jackson contract situation because there's so many different angles to it, including league collusion and just general racism, and then also difficulty in dealing with a guy who doesn't have an agent. So lots of complexities. But we spoke about the NFLPA's report card on which teams have the worst facilities over on ESPN and work environment, which I think is a powerful tool by the Players Union, as well as are the Arizona Coyotes in the NHL a money laundering operation, fronting as an NHL team. The Knicks are on a win streak. Derek Carr going to the Saints and more. YouTube.com/ESPN show. All right, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it. All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boys back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boys back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Cedar! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Denner.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Denner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. See white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them.
Oh. Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy!
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
Back.
We are back on the fun half of the Majority Report. Just opened up the phone lines. The number is 646-257-3920. We'll read some IMs, then we'll get into some fun stuff. Scatastic terrorist. That's spelled to mess up my pronunciation of it, so thank you. Question for Brandon. Ever play the Yakuza series? I think you'd love it if you haven't.
I didn't realize Hayaraichik was such a big video game person, but go ahead.
She is?
No, because if that's the username that reached out, yeah, okay. Thanks, Emma.
She's a real Capcom fan.
I was like, honestly, that seems very off-brand, but
I should say I have tried to play it, but there's just so much to do in that game. I do not like games that have a lot to do in them, except for Elden Ring and Dark Souls, which are perfect. Everything else that has too much, and I guess also Horizon Zero Dawn, but I just like playing games with bows in them. But like every other game that just has like a bunch of shit to do around the map, I get tired of. I can live my own life.
Yeah, Yakuza has a lot to do, and it's also sort of like arcade-like as well. So it's a little like it's a tough set. It's like I think they're really really good games. It's just they're a little complicated for me.
I want to like them. I want to like them, but I have to dedicate time in my life to liking them that I don't have right now.
Gotcha. Policy wonk. Nothing better than the fun half intro, but nothing worse than lack of Emma. Well, we alternate between those two, right? But both of them are very good, I would say. We don't even hear it, so it doesn't come through. But hey, DJ Danarchy, if you want to do an updated one, put me in it. I'm all for it.
Or any other DJs out there.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not in it. You're not in that Fun Half song. I never.
This is an old one. We sometimes play the older one, which I think I'm in it as like a guest because I used to come on the show. But that's about it. But I don't hear it because it just doesn't come through our earpiece. So I don't even, it doesn't register. Fruity Dinosaur, this dude rules for how blunt he's being about everything. Yes, that was really an excellent interview, I thought. Golden Oyster Cult, as far as gerrymandering goes, if the Supreme Court dares to recognize the outlandish independent legislature theory, then Michigan, Pennsylvania, California, New York, and every single other state who has control of the legislature needs to gerrymander all Republican districts out of existence, because states like Florida and Texas and so many others are going to do the same for Republicans. If Republicans already get supreme advantage in the Senate, we should make sure that they never hold the House again. If the Supreme Court wants to change the rules, then we should engage in malicious compliance. I agree that we should be fighting back and not unilaterally disarming on that front. Luckily, it seems like, didn't they punt the independent legislature theory to a little bit later? I could be wrong about that, but the sentiment holds. Golden Oyster Cult. Custodial artist Mark Space Wayne would start a hearing over the 100% death rate of dihydrogen monoxide consumption. Really cool. Matt Taibbi right now testifying at House Select Committee on weaponization of federal government hearing. Yes, we know. We'll get into that in a little bit. All right. Let's do this Tucker Carlson Charlie Kirk thing. Bradley. Okay. So this is fun. Charlie Kirk ran to the defense of Tucker Carlson yesterday, but then ran away from it just as quickly. Before we get into Charlie Kirk's defense, this is the context for it. So more and more texts are being revealed from the Dominion lawsuit, which show that Fox News hosts explicitly knew behind the scenes that the election fraud stuff being peddled by Trump and the crazy surrounding him like Giuliani and Sidney Powell was bullshit. That, of course, they understood that, and yet publicly they were singing a very different tune. That's central to what Dominion needs to prove in this case. And more texts, as I said, are being revealed from some of the hosts, namely Tucker Carlson, showing how he really feels behind the scenes and how disparate that is from his public commentary, where he's paid tens of millions of dollars to peddle